Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read from the prologue. This sets the tone for the whole story and moves the plot right away. I put it as a prologue, though, because it's not focused on the main character, so the main character actually doesn't show up yet. 15 years ago, just before sunset, lightning crashed across the dehydrated sky, and just as the tingled sun was engulfed by an amoebic light, a tiny hand grabbed hold of a new mother's finger. 15 years ago, just minutes after sunset, a confusing light. I'm going to do it again. Sorry.
Yep.
All right.
Hang on. I'm going to put a marker down.
Thanks. I'm going to take another
You're
step.
welcome, Carl.
Thank you, Carl, for editing. All right, we'll start again. 15 years ago, just before sunset, lightning crashed across the dehydrated sky, and just as the tingled sun was engulfed by an amoebic night, a tiny hand grabbed hold of a new mother's finger. 15 years ago, just minutes after sunset, a confusing lightning crashed once more. Professor Oliver Crowley's world fizzled and collapsed as Fitz Faraday's erupted for the very first time. The electric world that was Professor Crowley's was now the baby's. 15 years ago, when the lightning came, it chased thundered words that sunk in Professor Crowley's stomach like a pull from the center of the earth. You are hereby removed from your position and tenure is revoked. The Board of Trustees has terminated your grant and you are to vacate the university premises immediately without delay. You can't do this. On what grounds? Professor Crowley shouted, and he did so violently. His wild hair and even wilder sideburns and eyebrows flared out like an Angora's cat's. Dr. Walter Branham, a frightfully imposing man, stared down Professor Crowley with his yellowed eyes through his thin spectacles. As senior lecturer of parapsychology and psychology, Dr. Branham was intimidating, but his position was nothing compared to his tyrannical composure. From under his cascading academic robes, Lector Branham produced release papers and handed them to Professor Crowley. He then explained with a throaty voice full of contempt and malice, "This quorum has been convened to investigate the highly irregular and questionable." But he was interrupted by a waif of a woman. She seemed almost like a skeletal bird lost in her robes. As she emerged from Lector Branham's shadow, Madame Semple Drude's voice was sharp and raspy, as if her throat were worn by sandpaper. She interrupted with an "and unethical and immoral." Unnerved by his subordinate's interruption, Lector Branham added, "Yes, unethical and immoral experiments you have conducted." Madame Drude pointed menacingly at Professor Crowley with her crow-taloned finger and her equally hooked nose. She pointed at the release papers, vehemently demanding that Professor Crowley sign them. Professor Oliver Crowley responded almost sarcastically, "My research consists of only thought experiments and theories. Physical studies would be irresponsible." "We have evidence that you have actually performed experiments in materialization of the sublime," Lector Branham accused with a deep, resonant voice. As he stepped into the lantern light, a colossus of a man, his cold jawline and formidable face showed only the most grim and stern expression. Professor Crowley said incredulously, "What evidence? I would never be as careless too," but was interrupted once again. To Lector Branham's left, the burly, red-bearded Professor Hobart Hagen dramatically swung his academic robes. He took out an Erlenmeyer flask, capped by a Woods lamp that filled the flask with ultraviolet light. Under the purple glow, grains of light swirled about, each grain its own microscopic light bulb full of amber-colored incandescence. Then in his blusterous voice that contrasted so with Lector Branham's, Professor Hagen asked, "Look familiar?" Professor Crowley continued in a defeated voice, "As to create fully fledged materialization, these are vapors and non-corporeal, completely harmless. Why, they are perfectly invisible without the UV light." Lector Branham became agitated, but unlike most who would betray their thoughts with nervousness or flustered speech, when Lector Branham became disturbed, it was solemn and brooding. His evocative tone came from a deep pit in his bowel, and it burned with an infernal wrath rivaling that of Lucifer himself. "This is the poorest form of crackpot tripe. You are a weak-willed scientist, Mr. Crowley. Your methods are sloppy and reckless. You are the worst kind of parapsychologist, and your work endangers all of us," Lector Branham said as he clawed at the department emblem from Professor Crowley's robe. "Poor scientist? Crackpot? I think not, my Mr. Branham. The ingenious development you hold in your hand is a lifetime of unparalleled work. You, Mr. Hagen, and Miss Drude, are too narrow-minded to see that I have discovered the new DNA molecule, the new microchip. The contents of the Erlenmeyer flask are distilled thought, a thought materialized as physical form," Professor Crowley said darkly as he clutched his breast where the emblem was once pinned. This department was founded to discredit and disprove hoaxes, not manufacture them. This is an affront to nature and it must be destroyed, Lecter Branham demanded, showing no emotion, which was all the more menacing. Perhaps we should study it first, the bone-faced Drood argued, as her crow-like nose perked up. Hagen held the flask up to his eyes, and as with his meaty, sausage fingers he shook the contents, swirling the grains of light. He snorted. Seems harmless. So was the atom until Oppenheimer and Fermi ushered in the nuclear age, Lecter Branham cautioned. Lecter Branham waved a leather-bound journal, and Professor Crowley's face drooped with all the sadness of a wounded bulldog. The senior lecturer then thumbed through the pages and began reading, and I quote, "The cognitive resonator is what makes thought materialization possible." And then if you read on, you outline the very steps for this madness. There are drawings, diagrams, schematics, while you even give caution to the reader as if it were an instruction manual. This is absurd. I'm not signing those papers, Professor Crowley responded. Absurd? I will tell you what is absurd. Your methods. Again, I quote. First, align the 3 piezoelectric crystals by using the tuner. Then the first crystal receives, the second amplifies, and the third transmits. Then focus thoughts into the cognitive resonator, which materializes the thoughts as non-corporeal particles. Finally, use the manipulator glove to mold the thought particles into a corporeal, fully formed, translucent shape. It is best to use the id containment unit for any materializations, otherwise they could become loose. Quite dangerous, Mr. Crowley, wouldn't you agree? Madame Drood criticized through her thin, wrinkled lips. But those are just notes. You have my experiment. I simply dabbled with creating the particles. I never shaped, Professor Crowley said, his voice condescending. Enough. These notes describe a process completed, not a theory proposed, Lecter Branham shouted. In her most convincing buzzard impression, Madame Drood clutched the journal. She flipped the pages like a scavenger rending flesh from a carcass. She chirped, reading from a dog-eared page. Freud and Jung were mistaken. The unconscious, specifically the id, does not dwell deep in the mind or spirit. The id exists in an eldritch field, vibrating from an active mind, like clouds of free radicals. And like any field, when disturbed by another wave, the id can be seen as ripples in an interference pattern. She closed the book and then added, Tisk, tisk, Mr. Crowley, repudiating Freud and Jung with such risky and outlandish theories. This is very poor science. Who would ever take this under peer review? You have ignored so much and dared to run your own trials, cherry-picking evidence using suspect statistics, distorting your findings. How unprofessional. There is sufficient evidence, Lecter Branham commanded. What say the council? Disbarred, Madame Drood rasped. Disbarred, Professor Hagen agreed. Disbarred, it is unanimous. You are hereby disbarred and banned from the university, Lecter Branham commanded, settling the matter. So be it. My effects, if you will, Professor Crowley demanded, holding out his hand for the Erlenmeyer flask and the journal. I do not think so, Mr. Crowley. These are the property of the university, per your contract. All research conducted under your grant are for the benefit and gain of the university, Lecter Branham argued. Besides, it would be too reckless to entrust you with such dangerous work, Madame Drood added. Bad go, old chap. But you'll land on your feet, Professor Hagen said jovially, smacking Professor Crowley on his back. That journal and that flask are the products of a lifetime of research. But they do not matter, because everything I have learned I still remember, Professor Crowley said, and he tapped his temple, indicating the arcane knowledge he devised was still locked in his mind. You can practice your wizardry somewhere else, Mr. Crowley, but you will never practice it here at this university. Now, if you will not sign the severance agreement, and if you will not leave, you will be forced to call security. And reveal your secret counsel to the university? I think not, Professor Crowley mocked. Lecter Branham gazed Professor Crowley with yellow eyes. Lecter Branham was not in the habit of standing at full height. His barrel chest and broad shoulders already made men feel mousy under his titanic presence. But sensing his bluff called, he wanted this conversation ended. He rose as a sturdy oak does against the thrashing storm. It's fine. I will go, Professor Crowley said, feeling Lecter Branham's shadow flow over him as a cloud blocks the moon. Professor Crowley stormed out of the department library with such force. Thor's lightning would be but a spark compared to Professor Crowley's fury. And that's the end of the prologue.